guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are going to be making another dinosaur piece. I haven't done one in quite a while and I really want to dive into it. So we will have another one also coming up soon after I do a deer piece as well. But today we are going to be making a KENTROSAURUR. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, so the first thing that I'm going to do to make our KENTROSAURUR is I'm going to start on the clay pieces. Normally I tend to make the clay pieces first and then build everything around it, but every now and again I do get bored and I'll make the patterns and do all the sewing first and then make the clay pieces. It really just depends on the mood that I'm in. Anyways, I'm going to start the head like I normally do. I will make a lump of tin foil, kind of roughly cone shaped. That tends to be a good starting point for most clay heads. Anything that's kind of flatter, you almost don't even need to use tin foil for. So I'll make my little cone, I'll get everything completely covered in a nice layer of clay, smooth it out, and get a basic shape laid out first before I add any details to it. So the first detail that I normally start with are the eyes. I tend to make those first and then kind of build everything else around them. I'm not really sure why, it just kind of works that way for me. Now with these, I'm just using some little simple black beads that I have because I'm kind of low on supplies and I didn't have any glass eyes that I wanted to use for this. Most of mine were a little too large. So I'm just using some glass beads that are a black color, placing them in where I want the eyes to go, and then taking strips of clay and building up the eyelids around them. For this one, I will use extra strips of clay to kind of make wrinkles and to also build up the cheekbones and kind of the brow bone around the eye as well. I'm not trying to make the eye look sunken in, but I'm also not trying to make it look like it's bulging out. Now I'm going to leave most of these pretty simple. I really don't need to add a ton of detail. The shape for this head is really basic, so I'm just going to use my tools to make some holes for the nostrils, maybe adjust the shape a tiny bit, and then make a little line for the mouth. Once I have those placed, I'm going to adjust the shape of the head just a little bit, kind of just smooth things out, push in, just kind of adjust it so it doesn't look too cone shaped like the original shape that we started with. I want it to have a little bit more dimensions than just that basic shape. And then once I have the main details in place, I'm going to start adding texture. For this, you don't have to go completely all out and add scales throughout the whole entire face. You can mainly just add the extra detailed portions around the main details like the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. That's what I tend to do. And then as you move further away from those details, you can just add a texture to the face. You don't have to carve all the individual scales. So for this, I'm mainly just using a sharp tool to make some lines for the scales, and then I'm using a brush tool to add a bit of texture around that. And then after a few adjustments here and there, just kind of cleaning everything up and making sure that I like the shape of everything, I'm going to clean up the base of the head where we're going to connect it later to the doll, and then I'm going to put this in the oven for about 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then while our clay head is baking, I'm going to start on the feet. Now honestly, I think I should have made the feet a little bit bigger, but you learn as you go. So for this, I'm going to take portions of clay. I'm going to make some little balls all about the same size. I'm going to use 4 of them. I'm going to flatten them against the counter and then kind of make them a little bit coned, but I also want to leave a flat spot at the top where I'm going to make an indentation. This little hole is going to be used to add it to the wireframe later. After I have a basic shape laid out, I'm then going to start adding some details. So for this, I'm mainly just going to add some indentions to kind of separate where the toes would be, and then I'm also going to use some balls of clay to make the toenails. So I'm going to lay these out on the front of the foot, and then I'm going to use my tools to blend everything together and clean up the lines. Other than that, I'm really not going to add anything else. You can add a texture if you want, or you can even decorate the bottom of the foot, but because you're really not going to see the bottom of the foot, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So I'm going to put these in the oven for about 45 minutes, just like we did with the head, at 275 Fahrenheit. And then once all of our clay pieces are done baking, we can start painting them. Now for the colors that I want to use for my KENTROSAURUR, I mainly want to stay around a minty green color and then kind of some yellows. So I'm going to mix up and make a mint color to primer all of my clay pieces. I think I'm going to start with the face first, show you how I did that, and then we'll move on to the feet. So I'm going to paint over the entirety of the face. I'm going to get everything completely covered. If you need to do an extra coat, just wait for it to dry and then do that, and then wait for it to dry again, and then you can add the details. So I got everything covered, and then after that I started taking some yellows to make some highlights, mainly around the mouth and then different features like the eyes. I wanted to focus the yellow around these points to make them stand out a little bit, so I mainly did the yellow there, and then I kind of roughly brushed over the entirety of the face to kind of blend everything together. And then for the shadows, what I'm going to do, normally I tend to do a black, but because I want to stick with lighter colors, I'm going to use kind of a darker gray color, and I'm going to paint into all the little cracks around the eyes, the mouth, and the nose. Just kind of fill them in, and if anything gets on the outside, I can either paint over it or just wipe it away real quick. When I did this, I also watered down the paint just a little bit so it ran a little bit better and it would be a little bit more transparent so I wouldn't have just a really dark spot. Because again, I want to keep everything really light. I let that dry and then I moved on to painting some scale details on the face. I'm going to use a bit of a more olive green, but nothing too drastically different from the other colors that I'm using. Also, when doing this, I decided to try out using a dotting tool instead of a paintbrush, just to see if everything came out a little bit more rounded, because I've seen people paint with these before, and it does kind of work, but the paint is a little bit thicker than if you were to paint it on. Other than that, I really didn't add any other details. I let everything dry, and then I used one of my tools to scrape any of the paint that got on my glass beads that I'm using for the eyes. That way they were nice and clean. Moving on to painting the feet, we're going to primer them the same color that we primered the face. Let that dry. If you need to do another layer, make sure to do that as well. And then after that's dried, I'm going to start adding kind of a brighter highlight to the front of the feet to make the toes stand out a bit. So this is kind of where I'm adding the yellow. Of course, I'm going to have to let that dry again, and then I'm going to use the same watered down grays to add the shadows in between the toes. And then I'm going to use an unwatered down gray to paint the bottoms of the feet. And then lastly, I'm going to be painting the toenails. I just picked kind of a lighter green to make them stand out just a tiny bit. So those are the only pieces that we're going to be making out of clay. I'm going to be making the spikes out of Instamorph. If you don't know what Instamorph is, it's basically a type of moldable plastic that you can heat up and melt, and then it'll harden back into a shape that you formed. Now, most of the time, Instamorph is a white color, so if you want to have it a different color, you either need to paint it after you sculpt it, or you can mix in colors as you're melting everything. So I found if you add a little bit of acrylic paint, you can actually blend it into the Instamorph and change the color of it. So that's what I'm going to do for the spikes. I'm going to go for kind of a yellow, almost khaki color. Now I'm just going to use my hands, but you do need to be careful because again, this is hot, and I'm just going to roll out my spikes and add a little bit of a curve to them and let them harden. Once they've hardened, I'm going to actually resin over them because I want to add a glossy texture to them. So I'm going to glue them to some cardboard, and then when I'm painting the resin onto all the clay pieces, I'm also going to add it to this as well. Now, when I decided to go over the spikes with resin, I did add some mica powder to it to make them look a little bit more shimmery. Main reason that I like using resin to paint over all of my clay pieces and stuff is because it's a lot more sturdier than most varnishes, and it just helps protect everything a little bit better. So once we're done painting it onto all of our clay pieces and our spikes, you'll have to let everything dry and cure overnight. Most resin will take about 24 to 48 hours to cure, but we have plenty of other things to work on in the meantime. So I'm going to start on sewing the fabric for the body. So for the body, I tried to make it as simple as possible. I sketched out my pattern, and basically it will have a left and a right side, the legs, and then it will also have a strip of fabric that's going to be on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to use the pattern that I sketched out, and I'm going to cut out all my fabric. The fabric that I want to use is a sequence, and it's almost minty, but it's a little bit less green than I want it, so we'll adjust that later. So the first bit of sewing that we're going to be doing is we're going to take our left and right body pieces and the strip of fabric that's going to be for the belly, and we're going to sew these pieces together. Then we're going to take our sewing machine and we're going to sew the fabric for the legs. So each leg has an inside portion and an outside portion, and we're just going to sew down the front of them. We're going to leave the back open so it's easier to add to the body later. And then after that, you'll want to have all of your clay pieces and stuff ready because it's time to put everything together. So I made a very simple wire frame, and I'm going to start putting everything together on the wire frame. I'm going to start with the fabric body piece. I'm going to figure out where I want the wires for the legs to go, and I'm going to cut some holes into our fabric, and then I'm going to run the wires for the legs through those holes. After that, I'm going to take our clay head and I'm going to glue it to the wire for the neck, and then I'm going to take the fabric for the neck and I'm going to glue it around the base of the head. Now at this point I realized it was probably the best point to add our spikes, so I'm going to cut these off of the cardboard that we have them on, and I'm going to cut some holes into the fabric, slide the spikes through that, and glue them into place. You'll want to let them dry completely before you move on to closing up the body. Now after putting everything on the wireframe, I realized the piece for the backing needed to be adjusted, so I decided to use 1, a different type of fabric, and 2, a larger piece of fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this to the top portion of the head. I'm going to let that dry, and then we need to add our little sails. These I'm going to leave pretty simple. I just cut these out of felt. They're kind of more of a starchy felt, so they hold their shape a bit better. But I cut those out. I'm going to cut some holes in the fabric for the back, and I'm going to sew these in place as I'm going. So I'm going to get all of these done first, and then we're going to start closing up the sides of the body and stuffing the rest of the body. And then once we have the body put together, I'm then going to start adding the fabric for the legs. So I'm going to sew these in place around the wires that we have sticking out, and then we're going to adjust the length of our wires to add our clay pieces to it. So we're going to take our clay feet, wrap those onto the wire frame with another kind of thinner gauged wire, and then we can start gluing the fabric for the legs around the bases of those. And then I realized that the fabric for the legs were going to be a little bit too thin for the body, so I made some strips of fabric to go on the back of the legs to make them look a little thicker. So I'm going to sew these in place, and I'm also going to stuff the leg as I do that. So I ended up doing the front legs first and then moving on to doing the back legs. And then once I have the body all put together, I'm then going to start decorating it. So mainly going to be painting the body. I'm going to start off with my 3D fabric paints, and I'm going to start adding kind of a texture to everything. Now at this point I am going to probably paint over all of this as well, so it really doesn't matter what color I use, but I'm still going to try and stay around the same colors that I'm currently using. So I'm just going to add some texture to the backing of our Kentro, and then I'm also going to add kind of a bumpier texture to the sides to add to the scale texture that our sequins give. Once I'm done adding our texture, this is going to have to completely dry, and then we can start using our acrylics and stuff and start painting our scales and our fabric. For this, I'm going over everything very lightly. There's really not much paint to my brush when I'm doing this, and I'm just kind of lightly brushing over the surface when I want to add a color to it. So I'm going to start lightening everything. I'll add some shadows, different things like that. And then if I want, I can go into more detail and make more defined markings. So like at the very end, I decided that I wanted to add a hint of gold. So I decided to go over some of the scales that we added texture to with that gold paint to just make it stand out a little bit more. Guys, and this is my KENTROSAURUR. I'm pretty happy with it. The only thing that really kind of bugs me is I could not get the spikes to stand up correctly, so they're kind of like more off to the side, and they're supposed to be more upwards. So I need to kind of mess around and figure out how to go about doing that if I'm going to make something like this in the future. But other than that, I'm really happy with it. So I'm going to have this piece in my Etsy shop along with a bunch of other creatures. There's a lot of sales going on also. If you guys want to check that out, the links are down below. Also, I have a bunch of links for all the different types of art supplies that I tend to usually use to make my art dolls. These are affiliated links, so if you buy anything through them, it does help support the channel. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!